live inside a network of meanings of things, right? So for example, when you look at your mother, you're not looking at her as an object and then attributing all sorts of meanings to her. You see the meaning of your mother right away, and that meaning is multidimensional. It has a very long history, and it affects you directly at a physiological level. Maybe you hate her, and so the sight of your mother makes your heart race and your brain produce cortisol because she's categorized as unpredictable and chronic threat. That's a... Okay. Dominance hierarchies have been around longer than trees. They're real. They're really, really real. And you live in one. And not only do you live in one, you're really motivated to get to the top of that one, or to create one that you can be at the top of, because human beings are sneaky, eh? Because if we're not doing so well in the dominance hierarchy, we might think, well, to hell with this dominance hierarchy, we'll just make a new one. And that's what little bird is sitting out there saying, I'm healthy and loud, and if you come over here, I'll peck you to death, because this is my tree. And so the songbirds distribute themselves around the neighborhood by dominance. And that's what a creative person does. It's very sneaky. So it's very important to be up near the top of the dominance hierarchy, because it means you live, that's good. You live without so much stress, that's also good. And your probability of successfully reproducing, or say of having many mating opportunities, goes up, especially in the case of men. It's like an exponential improvement. So if you ever wonder why men are so competitive, that's the reason. It's because the loser men get nothing. Really, that's exactly how it works. And the winner men, they get everything.
Okay, today I just want to talk a little about Freudian slips. We just saw a few clips from lecture 2 in the Psychology of Personality lecture series 2015 by Jordan Peterson. And I made a couple of videos on this a week or two ago. And while making it, it was just striking me that the audience kept laughing. And I was thinking, the audience doesn't realize what they're laughing. So what Peterson is basically saying is that the fact you're laughing says there's some truth to there. So what exactly is this? Well, this goes back to our old favorite Sigmund Freud. And he came out with a book, one of his books called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. He talks about things like slips of the tongue. He talks about jokes, why are jokes funny? And what's a slip of the tongue? Slip of the tongue is where you say one thing, you mean to say another, and some are very funny. So, for example, you might have somebody's interested in another person romantically, maybe consciously, maybe not consciously, but they don't want the other person to know. And so let's say in the business setting, for example, so they might say, I'm looking forward to our next meeting. And so they say, I'm looking forward to our next mating, so it can be funny. Another one might be, a person might be very fat, and you're sitting in a room with a cat, and you say, please pass the cat. Instead you say, please pass the fat, because that's on the mind, so you're letting it slip out. So these are kind of funny examples. There's many funny examples where we let the cat out of the bag, as it were. And so what exactly is happening, and why all this giggling and stuff? So basically what's happening with the Freudian slip is that something which we want to hold inside ourselves, something which we don't want to let out, pops out. And to really understand it, we have to understand a book of Sigmund Freud's called Dream Psychology, the Interpretation of Dreams. And he has some interesting charts of that. And he basically comes out with a idea that the dream is a wish fulfillment. And so basically we have, early in life, we basically have a very instinctual self. But we have to learn to fit into civilization. So we learn to repress this self, and that self which is repressed is controlled by a thing called the superego, which is also we would call the inner critic. And in one of his books called Civilization and Its Discontents, he basically says that the price of civilization is guilt. Another way of saying it will be the price of civilization is repression. We must repress certain things because we have an instinctive side, but we can't be 100% honest all the time. We also have a thing called a fight and flight instinct, so we tend to want to either punch our way out of a situation or run away, and neither are appropriate in our complex civilization. So what Freud is basically saying is that we've got these impulses, so they're repressed, but they must come out. So he has little diagrams in the Interpretation of Dreams book where he basically shows that the naughty thought, and what is a naughty thought? It's not objectively naughty, it's whatever naughty to you. So it's down to your superego, and different people have ideas, different ideas, what's naughty, what's not acceptable. Usually it's talked about societal norms, could be religious norms, or something that they want to face up to, which I'll get back to in a second. So basically this naughty thought will capture or cling on to a less naughty thought will come out. And the two primary mechanisms that we see in sleep and dreams is metonymy and metaphor. And basically metaphor is basically where there's multiple meanings, and metonymy is where everything looks flat and the same. And so basically so you actually have a thing called condensation, where many things are mixed together. And so basically, let's say, for example, you're having a favorite uncle who has a beard, and then you have a boss who has a beard, the boss who has a beard you don't like. So you see your uncle, your favorite uncle, and they start saying nasty things to you in the dream. So you never say that. So what you're actually thinking about, you're not thinking about your uncle, you're thinking about your nasty boss who has a beard, but you don't see your nasty boss because you don't want to see your nasty boss. Instead, you see your uncle. But the criticism of the nasty boss is coming through in the form of your uncle who you actually like, because you can't face or deal with the actual conflict with your boss. You're trying to repress it, not deal with it. So these thoughts will try and come up in all sorts of different ways, and so in dream symbolism they try and come up. But also these repressed thoughts try and come up as well, and they come up in the way of Freudian slips. So getting back to the example, if you fancy your co-worker and say, I'm looking towards the next meeting instead of the next meeting, or you could have, say, for example, a school teacher saying that the exam we're going to test the last 3 chapters. Instead, that teacher felt that the things hadn't gone well, so instead the teacher says, in the exam we're going to test the last 3 disasters. So usually with a slip it will be very similar in sounding. So we're going to test the last 3 chapters. Instead they say we're going to test the last 3 disasters. Very closely sounding, even though the letters are quite different. So what's happening here is obviously the teacher feels that what they're teaching was a disaster, but he don't want to say it. So sometimes what's happening with the Freudian slip, always the truth is coming out, or the perceived truth is coming out of how you feel about things in a Freudian slip. Now sometimes you might be aware of the Freudian slip. So for example, you might be aware that those classes were a disaster, or you might be aware that you fancy your workmate. Sometimes you may not. So often the Freudian slip will be something you're not even aware of yourself. So it can be something that you're trying to repress, you're trying to hold back, or it can be something that you're not even aware of. And so it comes out as a slip, as a Freudian slip. The other interesting thing is laughter. And one of the chapters in the book, The Psychopathology of Daily Life, Freud talks about humor and laughter. And he basically says the reason why we laugh at the joke is the lifting of repression. So this is a very interesting idea. If you talk to people who take antidepressants, for example, antidepressants are very useful at controlling depression. But most people who take antidepressants for a long period of time, often they feel that their life is dulled down and not exactly the way they'd like their life to be. They feel not as lively as it used to be, not spontaneous as it used to be, kind of duller version. And this would make logical sense if you think of the terms of what Freud is talking about, repression. And it's not always universally the case. Some people take antidepressants, feel fine, but some people find them quite repressing. So basically, what Freud is basically saying is that we have this instinctual side, we have to hold it in to repress it, because we can't, see an attractive person in the street and go up and start groping them. We can't be angry at our boss and just start shouting at everybody. And some people, you just think of Asperger's syndrome, where some people have issues where they keep on saying. That's actually an issue where they're literally telling you what's on their mind. In the case of people using, say, foul language and so on, which can be the case sometimes in Asperger's. So these repressive mechanisms are required to fit into society. We can't say everything we want to say. And just think of how political societies, you could have a friend, for example, let's say your friend is an Amway salesperson, and anybody who's taking Amway products, you probably agree they're rather pricey, and it's questionable whether they're high quality. And what Amway basically trades on is getting friends to sell to other friends, and so you don't want to criticize them or criticize their price because you don't want to lose your friendship. Now, that said, some of these Amway products are good, but they are pricey. So let's say you really don't like Amway and your friend comes around and talk about how great Amway is. So you would love to tell them that this is a bullshit product and that you feel Amway is just taking everybody for a ride, including them, because very few people make money in Amway, very few people at the top, but you don't do it. Your another neighbor and they have a particular religious belief, you don't buy into it, again, you don't say it. Somebody else, let's say you have another friend, and the friend, they eat like a pig as far as you're concerned. They're slobbering and the food is slobbering, but they're a good friend. You don't say anything. So we're repressing all the time. And if you're totally honest all the time, you'll have no friends, you probably won't have a job, you probably won't have a wife, and your kids probably won't talk to you. So you're kind of forced in society to some degree to choose to repress. But also often we're repressing from ourselves. We don't even realize what we really think or what we feel. And so all these things have to find some way of getting out. But the problem is the repressive mechanism. If I'm in a situation where I want to tell somebody I don't like, say I don't like Amway, for example. I'm neither for or against Amway, but I'll just take an example. Let's say Amway products, for example. To some degree, I'm not being my full expressive self. I'm holding myself back. To some degree. I'm not being 100% honest. To some degree, I'm not being as expressive as it could be. Think in terms of somebody who is repressing something and they don't know they're repressing. And it requires quite a lot of effort. There's a couple of videos I made here, one on where I actually read the chapter or the lecture on repression by Freud, and another is where I talk about the actual study notes on it. It's a very fascinating topic. But Freud says sometimes his repression is fairly effective, sometimes not. If it's not effective, there's a tendency to double down. So kind of the repressive mechanisms inside our subconscious mind, or what Freud called it, unconscious mind, same thing, subconscious, unconscious. It's surprisingly similar to autocratic society, like these sort of dominant societies like the communists and so on in their day. Autocratic government that, when some people try and say something against the government, does the government accept it? No, if you're an autocratic government, you double down. And strange enough, maybe this is just a copy of how your subconscious mind or unconscious mind works, because it also doubles down. So the tendency, if the repression is not working, it tends to work harder and harder. And so you might say, why exactly we're repressing? Well, obviously I'm saying we're repressing to some degree because we want to fit society. But also what happens, the whole stability of your personality is based upon a kind of equilibrium. And if there's some thought in that equilibrium that's throwing you out of that equilibrium, it might be that you cannot face it. You don't even know that you have this thought and these series of feelings. And so you repress and you repress and you repress. And that's a mechanism that's going on. And it's obviously going to be much stronger if it's censored to such a degree you don't even have the thought. So I can have a thought, I don't like Amway, I know it. But imagine a thought that you don't even know you have that thought. That's a very powerful thing. And the mind will try harder and harder. And again, if you get back to that paper of Freud's on depression, the efforts will often be stronger, more repressive, and yet less effective. And so sometimes highly ineffective. So if repression is not going well, if that naughty thought's coming out that could blow your entire stability or personality, the mind will try higher and higher and higher. Just like in an autocratic society, a society whereby you've got a centralized government, maybe a fascistic society, maybe a communistic society, but certainly a society that dominates the people. For example, a society where you have a tyrannical leader, for example, or a tyrannical oligarchy or whatever. So they will tend to double down with their efforts to keep the political dissidents. So these naughty thoughts are like political dissidents. So just like an autocratic society, there's a tendency to double down on political dissidents. So your naughty thoughts are actually just like political dissidents for you. And you might be thinking, how could a thought be so powerful that would require... You might be thinking, how could it be that thought be so powerful that would require such a level of repression? There's a very good Shakespearean play you could always check out called Hamlet. And in Hamlet, basically this guy's a prince of Denmark, and his father dies, and then 6 weeks later his uncle, the father's brother, marries his mother, and he's very disturbed, and then the ghost of his father will come, and it turns out that the brother murdered him, and Hamlet just loses the plot, and it's a big revenge thing. But if you just look at that play, if you get a chance to see, you'll just see how wild Hamlet is, and he's just losing it throughout the movie. And this is the problem with some of those thoughts that we have. And remember, it could be an unacceptable thought, as in something that goes against our societal norms or against our inner critic, but could also be an undermining thought, a thought that just makes us feel very bad or feel very foolish or feel very weak in some way. And it might be so undermining that it might actually threaten our very survival. It might actually threaten their mental emotional stability. And this is the problem. We end up basically like Hamlet, we end up falling apart. So everything your mind is doing is an effort to protect itself, an effort to create a kind of a balance. Okay, so that's why we repress. But the problem with the repression is, just like if you take a lot of antidepressant pills, you might become a duller version yourself. Repression can make you dull, and if it's a thought that's very difficult to deal with, then it might become more and more and more repression. And the more repression is just like that thing. If you have like a very autocratic society, and there's a lockdown, and you're only allowed out for 1 hour a day, and your life becomes more and more oppressive. The same thing with repression is very strong and active. You'll become more and more emotionally dull. So to some degree in our society, forget about you personally, but in our society, we are dulled down to some degree. And so things like humor allows us to relieve the repression, because the humor usually deals with a naughty thought. Difficult these days in our woke times, because it's hard because people say something humorous and everything is criticized. But traditionally, humor was not criticized. And if you actually go back to the ancient kings in Europe, they always had a court clown who was basically a jester. And the only person who could make fun of the king was actually the court jester. He had a very special place. And psychologically, the jester, the clown, the fool, which is also an archetype in Jungian analytical psychology, has a place. Because like a release of a pressure valve, okay? We look at a place like North Korea when the leader dies and the people basically in mass emote for hours and days. This is sort of a side effect of a very repressed society. It's not a good sign to see. So when we laugh, we're laughing because a little bit of the truth of how we think and feel is coming out. But we daren't say it because either we're trying to fit in with other people so we can't tell the truth all the time, or maybe there's certain thoughts or feelings or anxieties which the kind of the egregore, which is the group spirit, as it were, of the people feel. Now, some of the concepts I'm using here are not Freudian. Freud would not talk about archetypes or egregore. That's analytical psychology, which is Jungian. But you get the idea. He would talk about repressed thoughts, and it's like the thought itself has its own little identity, its own little mini personality. It's rather amazing when you think about it. But yeah, humor, when we laugh, the truth comes out, and so we laugh because the repression is lifting. So when we lift repression, we feel happier and happier, more excited. And then you might see the counter argument, why don't we lift repression all the time? And people try this, like people, drug culture back in the 1960s, for example, and 70s, all these people to tune in and drop out, or whatever that famous quote was. But the problem is then civilization can't work where people are just letting it all hang out. That's a challenge as well. So you can't be unrepressed all the time. It's very difficult to deal with. And like I said, people will not fit in properly. They'll be too aggressive, they'll be too sexual, and they'll be too honest. And it goes both ways. One way is simply telling things, as it were, things that you don't want to share because politically will. And when I say politically, as in your family and friends will talk to you and your boss will fire you, but also then deeper thoughts and feelings which might be difficult to deal with. So they have a place. So just thought it was interesting to see here the people giggling here and there over interesting things like the relationships to the mother, over things like that men either get everything or they get nothing. The loser, the winner takes it all. These are true concepts, things like the winner takes it all in romantic situations. It's a truth, but people don't like to face up to it. That you can create your own dominance hierarchy, because the idea of being so naughty, to create your own dominance hierarchy. That's creativity, is creating your own dominance hierarchy, which you become, in other words, rather than fighting the rat race, create your own rat race, and you'll be the chief rat, as it were. So it's just interesting to see how much of this is going on. And if you're finding that you're ever doing this, that you're sitting giggling and you don't know why, It's basically, or you say funny things, you don't know why you say funny things, they're basically Freudian slips, and they are a very powerful effect in our life. Another interesting thing which you can also use as a gauge with Freudian slips, and yes, there's no cure for Freudian slips, we're all going to do Freudian slips, but the real thing is to observe a Freudian slip. Why did I say that, and what is that telling me? Not necessarily, there's two types of truth. One truth is the objective truth, like the sun rises in the morning, or rises in the east, sets in the west. We all know that. Like, that's an objective truth. But it's also subjective truths, the way I feel about a certain person, or the way I feel about certain things. It's just telling the truth of how I feel and think, not necessarily that I'm objectively correct. And it's good to tune in and see what that's about. A very common thing that we see, for example, is people saying things like, say, for example, you have a colleague or a friend, say your friend's name is Bob, and you have your brother's name is Rob, for example, and you actually really like Bob. So you actually say, hey, Rob, my name's not Rob. Oh, sorry, Bob. Why are you using that name? And sometimes the name are not at all related. So it could be Bob, and your brother who you love so much is Francis. Say, hey, Francis. Well, why do you call me Francis? That tells you something about the relationship with that person, how you feel about that person, that you suddenly, and we do this a lot actually, that we're affectionate towards somebody and we actually use that our brother or son or daughter or husband's name, and it doesn't necessarily mean, for example, let's say a lady's husband's name is Michael, and her colleague is John, and she says Michael instead of John. If you're in that situation, it doesn't necessarily mean that this lady wants to have a sexual relationship with John. It could mean that she loves him in the same way she loves this guy. So it just gives you some indication of affection towards people. That often if you mix names between people, it tells you a lot. Particularly, I mean, to some degree, if you're going to use your husband's name rather than some other name, maybe it might indicate something romantic, but usually often not. It's like things like a brother's name or a son's name or a daughter's name or something. It's just a little tip for you, a little trick that will tell you that affection is there towards that person, and or that you might just feel they're very similar to that person. That's another possibility. But very interesting Freudian slips. Check out that paper. It's a very interesting paper, and you can check out the book as well, Psychopathology of Everyday Life. It's actually very, very, very practical. I thought it was interesting that when we see group human behavior, it's always fascinating to behold, and nice to see Jordan Peterson in his own quirky way handling this. Hope you liked the video. Please like, subscribe if you do. I'll talk to you next time.